Chapter 1. The Last Pint of the Lion's Tail. The bell rang at the Lion's Tail, an old pub tucked between a derelict bookshop and a pawn shop that hadn't changed its window display since 1983. It was Thursday afternoon, and the pub stank of mildew, strong ale, and stale peanuts. That meant it was time for the usual suspects. Brian Reeder, known on the streets as Bricks for reasons he refused to explain, leaned on the sticky oak bar and sipped the bitter with the patience of a monk and the weariness of a man who'd once robbed a bank with a spoon. Opposite him sat Terry Perkins, 3 teeth missing, hair like tumbleweed, and a laugh that could empty a tube carriage. He wore a velour tracksuit with mustard stains older than some bartenders. "So," Terry said, lighting a cigarette despite the smoking ban, "one last job, eh?" Brian didn't answer at first. He stared into his pint, as if it were a crystal ball. He didn't want another job. His knees didn't want it. His back didn't want it. And his pacemaker certainly didn't want it. But the money did. Hatton Garden, he said finally, like he was naming a ghost. Terry froze. "That's suicide." Brian smiled. "Then we've lived too long." He pulled out a manila folder from his coat, creased, coffee-stained, filled with floor plans, schematics, and CCTV schedules. Terry's eyes widened. "Where the bloody hell did you get this?" "A friend on the inside. Systems engineer. Owes me from back in '92. Still has all his fingers thanks to me." Terry leafed through the folder with reverence, the way a priest might hold forbidden scripture. "This is real, innit?" "It's vulnerable," Brian said. "New alarm. Rushed install. They thought Easter weekend would be quiet." Terry chuckled. "Oh, bless their sweet, naive corporate hearts." He ordered 2 more pints. "I'll get the boys." Later that night, the old booth at the back of the pub filled with ghosts of London's criminal past. Danny, the ghost. Jones arrived in a trench coat and combat boots. He used to be SAS, then MI5, then someone for someone else. Now, he fed pigeons and had conversations with his microwave. Kenny Soft Hands Collins, nearly 80, was pushed in by his niece. He wore bifocals and a shirt that read, "World's Best Grandpa," ironically earned. Last was Billy Lincoln, a wiry, tattooed 40-something who once ran messages for Brian as a teen. They called him the Weasel. He still looked like he owed someone money. Brian raised his glass. "Gentlemen," he said, "this might be the stupidest thing we've ever done." Danny leaned forward. "Then I'm in." Kenny adjusted his hearing aid. "What?" He said, "He's in." Terry shouted. "Oh," Kenny nodded. "Lovely." Billy downed his pint and grinned. "When do we start?" Brian exhaled deeply. "We don't. Not until we're sure no one dies this time." Terry coughed. "Speak for yourself. I had a stroke last week watching Antiques Roadshow." The table roared with laughter. In the corner of the pub, under a flickering bulb, the last great heist in British history was born. Danny leaned back in a cracked leather booth, folding his arms. "So, how many people are we talking? You've got 5 of us now." Brian shook his head. "Not people. Professionals. Each of you has a role. No one else." Billy raised a brow. "That's it? No muscle? No getaway driver?" Brian pointed at Danny. "There's your muscle." Then at himself. "There's your driver." "I haven't driven since the Blair administration," Terry muttered, sipping his pint. "I didn't say you were driving," Brian quipped. "You'll be in the back, like cargo." Terry snorted. "Put a blanket over me, and I'll play dead." Kenny leaned in, his voice a little louder than necessary. "Wait, are we sure we can do this? I mean, my arthritis is acting up. My knees make more noise than a cappuccino machine, and I forget where I put my teeth this morning." Brian gave him a steady look. "We're not robbing the Bank of England. We're crawling through a shaft and drilling a wall. If you can play 3 hours of bingo without a nap, you'll survive this. Danny nodded. The weakness is time. That's the trick. We're not going in with ski masks and guns. We're ghosts. We vanish in. We vanish out. Sounds poetic, Billy said. But this ain't poetry. It's 14 million quid sitting behind a foot of concrete and 2 inches of reinforced steel. And I've got the key, Brian said. That made everyone pause. Brian reached into his coat again and pulled out a tiny USB stick. Security override, he said. Temporary access credentials. Valid until April 7th. Our little Easter miracle. Bless the Lord and pass the Hilti drill, Terry said, raising his pint. Billy leaned over the table, scanning everyone's face. So we're really doing this? The bad grandpa's right again. Brian tapped his glass to signal the bartender. We're not doing it yet. We prepare. We plan. This isn't the old days. We can't run through windows anymore. If anyone falls over during this job, we all need a paramedic. Kenny nodded solemnly. I already had mine on speed dial. The days that followed were a whirlwind of creaky knees and clandestine meetings. Danny booked a dusty storage unit near Farringdon, which became their headquarters. It smelled like damp regret and old tires. Inside, they set up folding chairs, old maps, a dartboard, and a whiteboard labeled Project Resurrection. Brian paced in front of it, barking orders like a geriatric general. Kenny, you handle the cameras and surveillance. You're our eyes. Kenny tilted his head. And my eyes ain't what they used to be, but I'll give it a go. Danny, you'll handle the shaft descent and breach. You've still got the best back in the game. Danny flexed. Something popped. Brian continued. Terry, you and Billy are on tools. Drills, crowbars, whatever else you need to get us through that wall. Should we get a jackhammer? Billy asked. Terry waved him off. Subtlety, lad. We want to crack it open, not wake the queen. They worked in shifts. Drills buzzed. Saw screamed. Kenny fumbled with a CCTV system that was older than his hearing aid. Danny scouted the sewer layout for backup escape routes. Billy ran courier trips, bribed contacts, and bought burner phones from a lad who thought he was selling to TikTok pranksters. They were tired. They were achy, but they were alive again. A week before the heist, Brian gathered the crew around a battered table. I want to walk through the timeline, he said, minute by minute. We do this right. We're ghosts. Do it wrong, and we'll be playing bridge in Belmarsh. He unrolled a massive tea-stained floor plan. Entry point, lift shaft via basement. Door access controlled by code and physical override, which we now have. Thanks to your USB magic stick? Danny asked. Brian nodded. Exactly. Once we're down, we hit the wall. Terry, Billy, you'll be the first to drill. What about the noise? Kenny asked. Drilling echoes. Brian smiled. Already covered. We'll be working under a full power maintenance permit. One of Billy's connections slipped it into the building's internal schedule. They'll think it's contractors fixing the fire suppression system. Fake uniforms? Danny asked. Already ordered, Brian said, pointing to a duffel bag in corner. From the same bloke who makes the real ones. Kenny laughed. We're basically the NHS of crime. Exactly, Brian said. Once the wall is breached, we're inside the vault corridor. That's where it gets tricky. They all lean closer. The vault door stays locked. We don't touch it. We go for the boxes around it. There are over 600. We take only what we can carry. In and out by Monday. No returning for leftovers. Billy raised a hand. What about transport? We use the old laundry service exit on the south side. Danny will rig a pulley system to lower bags to the underground tunnel. From there, we move everything to a van Kenny parks 2 streets over. "I'm still not clear on the getaway," Kenny said. "With all that loot, we'll look like a mobile jewelry store." Brian grinned. "We won't look like anything, because we'll leave in separate taxis, dressed like pensioners. Nothing unusual there. The real getaway is the next morning. We rendezvous in Croydon. Billy and I drive the goods to the fence in Suffolk. Cash payout in 2 weeks. And if it goes pear-shaped," Danny asked. Brian's face darkened. "If it goes bad, scatter. Destroy your burner phones. Burn your kit. You were never there." "Like ghosts," Kenny said quietly. Brian looked around the room, into each pair of wrinkled, tired, but determined eyes. "This is it. Our last dance." Terry lit a cigarette, hoped the music slow. On the night before the job, they met again at the Lion's Tail. The pub was emptier than usual. Rain lashed against the windows, and the jukebox played My Way like a personal message from the universe. Brian wore a suit. Kenny showed up in a tracksuit and bow tie, claiming it was formal sporty. Danny had cleaned up and even shaved, revealing a jawline that hadn't seen the light of day since Thatcher. Terry raised his pint. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we risk everything. But tonight, we drink like kings. And tomorrow, we drill like dentists," Billy added. Brian chuckled. "Let's just hope the tooth doesn't bite back." They toasted, laughed, reminisced about old jobs, lost friends, and the time Terry accidentally locked himself in a vault overnight and ate 40,000 pounds in caviar to survive. By the end of the night, the laughter had softened into silence. Brian looked around, eyes misty. "If we don't come out of this," he said, "I want it known. I'd rather go down swinging than rust away in a care home." Danny placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're with you, Brian. All the way." Billy nodded. "To the end." Kenny added, "Just don't make me run." Terry raised his glass one last time. "To the bad grandpas. May we be bold, quiet, and forgotten by Monday." And once again, in the shadowed corner of the pub, the man with the gin and tonic watched. He took another photo, this time zoomed in. He smiled and typed a short message to his contact in the Metropolitan Police. "They're planning something. Get ready." Attached, IMG /2031/_Lionstail Surveillance.jpg. Chapter 2, Pigeons, Power Tools, and Pensioners. Brian Brick's reader stood at the center of the warehouse, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a long overcoat that had seen more than its fair share of funerals, arrests, and wedding receptions. His eyes, sharp and calculating, moved across the layout of the Hatton Garden safe deposit, building drawn in chalk on a wide slate board. "You lot sure you're ready to do this?" he asked, turned to face the mismatched gang. They were all there. Terry the Mouth Perkins was noisily slurping tea from a chipped West Ham mug. Danny, the ghost, Jones examined a set of ear defenders like they were ancient relics. Kenny Softhand Collins sat beside a box of surveillance equipment, looking equal parts confused and proud. And Billy the Weasel Lincoln flipped a screwdriver in his palm with the smugness of a man who still thought he was on the winning side of life. "I was born ready," Terry announced. "Been breaking into things since before you could tie your shoes." "You're 75, Terry," Brian said. "You were already wearing loafers when I was born." Kenny chimed in. "Don't forget, I set up the loop for the security feed. They won't see a thing." "You sure it'll work?" Danny asked. "As sure as I am that sugar doesn't go in tea," Kenny said with conviction. Billy raised his hand. "Actually, don't start," Brian warned. Danny laid out the plan, using matchbox cars and empty tea mugs. "We go in through the lift shaft. No alarms down there. We knock through the wall next to the vault. Drill, chisel, the works. It'll be like chipping a hole in a coffin." "Cheery," Billy muttered. And we do it over Easter weekend, Brian said. Place will be dead. Security's lax. And if anyone questions why we're there, we're just the maintenance lads fixing the electrics. Terry raised his mug in a toast. To the resurrection of our bank accounts. God help us, Kenny mumbled. The next week was a frenzy of preparations. Kenny set up a makeshift surveillance station in the back of an old van parked near the warehouse. It was filled with dials, screens, radios, and wires, most of which were probably illegal, all of which were outdated. A faint smell of petrol, crisps, and old man cologne permeated the cramped space. I got this beauty on eBay, he said proudly, showing Brian a signal scramble the size of a car battery. Still works if you slap it hard enough. Brian looked at it skeptically. And when was the last time you tested it? 2 days ago. Accidentally jammed the neighbor's skybox. They miscalled the midwife. Billy sourced the tools. Hilty drills, hammers, bolt cutters, crowbars, pry bars. He borrowed half of them from a construction site in Croydon, and the rest from a man called Spider Steve. Spider Steve? Danny repeated. Don't ask, Billy replied. Is that the bloke with the eye tattoo? No, that's Lizard Paul. Danny blinked. You've got a very troubling contact list. Back in the warehouse, Danny and Terry practiced with a drill against slabs of concrete, propped up like disgraced tombstones. You're pushing too hard, Danny barked. You're not pushing enough. It's not a bloody pastry, Terry. Tell that to my shoulder. It feels like I just wrestled a badger. Meanwhile, Brian refined the plan. He studied every possible entry and exit route, right down to sewer access. He reviewed security footage, studied guard patrol patterns, even watched the bin collection schedule to determine when the alley would be clear. He plotted the heist not like a burglar, but like a general preparing for war, except older, slower, and with more joint cream. One afternoon, Kenny shuffled in late, carrying a laptop, a thermos of Bovril, and a pigeon on his shoulder. What the hell is that? Brian asked, pointing to the bird. This is Sir Clux-a-Lot, Kenny said proudly. He's my lookout. You brought a bloody pigeon to a felony? He's got better eyesight than me. You need a hobby. A few nights before the job, they gathered in the back of the warehouse for a final rundown. A battered whiteboard listed each of their responsibilities. Brian tapped it with a wooden pointer he claimed was from the war. No one was quite sure which war. Final assignments, he said. Kenny, you're in the van. Jam the signals. Loop the feeds. And for God's sake, no snacks near the equipment. I'll bring wet wipes, Kenny replied, scribbling a note in his Sudoku book. Terry and Danny, you're the drilling team. Be surgical. No cowboy crap. Please, Terry scoffed. I'm a professional. You once used a car jack to open a phone booth, Brian reminded him. And it worked, didn't it? Billy, you're the runner. Tools, parts, food, drinks. And if we need a distraction, you start fire. Billy's eyes lit up. Seriously? No, but be ready. Just once. I want to use a flare gun. No. Brian continued. We move in early Friday morning. We go dark. No phones. No outside contact. This is the big one. Lads, we screw this up. We're not just retired. We're incarcerated. Danny nodded. Understood. Agreed, said Terry. Kenny added. My ex-wife always said I'd end up in prison or dead. Joke's on her, I'm going to be rich. They all laughed, even Brian. There was an electricity in the air that hadn't existed for years. For once, the aches in their joints and the weight of the decades melted away. They were back. Old? Sure, but they were still the best. The night before the heist, they met at the Lion's Tail one last time. Brian nursed a pint of bitter, while Terry showed off a pocket notebook labeled asterisk, things to steal, asterisk, Silver candlesticks, vintage Rolexes, solid gold pens. Who still has those? Probably the same people who still wear fedoras, Billy muttered. Danny raised his glass. To one last miracle. To diamonds, Billy cheered. To not getting caught, Kenny added. To being bloody legends, Terry toasted. Brian looked around the table. The faces of the last great crew in London's criminal folklore. They were battered, worn, slightly wheezy, but as God, they still had the fire. To the bad grandpas, he said softly. They clinked glasses. But in the corner of the pub, unseen by all, a man sipped his gin and tonic and took a quiet photo with his phone. The image, 5 men at a table, laughing like kings. Later, he sent it to a contact at the Met. No caption, just a file name. Garden Party 1 JPG. The next morning, at precisely 4:03 a.m., the van rolled out of the warehouse, heading toward London's glittering vault of secrets. The city was asleep. The bad grandpas were wide awake, ready, primed, and armed with a box of digestive biscuits and a bloody good plan. Chapter 3. Reconnaissance at Hatton Garden. By the time Monday morning rolled around, the men had all sworn an oath to never again get drunk and agree to crime. That lasted until 10:15 a.m., when Brian rolled up in a battered Ford Transit van that looked like it had escaped from a scrapyard mid-auction. Terry climbed into the passenger seat with a thermos of tea and a large bacon bap. You know, for an international jewel thief, you really should invest in a better ride. Brian grunted, tapping the dashboard. Still runs. That's more than I can say for your legs. Cheeky sighed. They drove in silence toward Hatton Garden, London's famed diamond district. Sleek glass facades and posh boutiques gleamed on the sidewalks, a far cry from the smoky pubs and peeling wallpaper their usual haunts. This was the kind of street where people wore watches worth more than Brian's pension. Their target, the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Limited, sat on a corner like a retired banker, solid, nondescript, unimpressed. A squat beige building that didn't flaunt itself, but exuded quiet wealth. It was a fortress wrapped in stone, pretending to be an office block. Inside, behind reinforced concrete and metal, were hundreds of safety deposit boxes, filled with decades of secrets. Cash, diamonds, bearer bonds, gold coins, perhaps even love letters best forgotten. Some belonged to jewelers, others to those who didn't trust banks or governments. It was a museum of London's under-the-table history. Brian parked a few blocks away, and they began their recon. Kenny's soft hands, Collins was already across the street, dressed as an old man, which was convenient. Since he was one, he fed pigeons like any other retiree. In his jacket pocket was a tiny receiver rigged to scan wireless security signals. Signal chatters low, he said over the earpiece. Security systems mostly silent during holidays. New alarms interfacing badly with the fire suppression panel. Brian, listening from the van, nodded. You're sure it loops the CCTV when triggered? Kenny smiled. Brian, I used to teach in my six how to build listening bugs with radios from Woolworths. This lot, they're using Poundland tech. I've seen karaoke machines harder to crack. Terry squinted across the road. What's the guard situation? Kenny pointed with a breadcrumb-covered finger. 2 during the day. 1 sleeps overnight in the office upstairs. Bloke 62. Saw him nod off during countdown yesterday. Perfect, Brian murmured. Meanwhile, Danny the ghost, Joan slipped a back alley wearing high-vis and pushing a mop. The cleaner's closet was a shared utility between Hatton Garden and a legal office next door. It had a camera, now carefully sprayed with lens oil, and a door with a keypad Danny had already copied. He took his time in the corridor, observing. Pipes, wires, the shape of the air vents, even the pattern of the ceiling tiles. His mind, still sharp and surgical, sketched schematics behind his eyes. He returned to the cleaner's closet, opened the panel he'd marked, and nodded to himself. CCTV wiring shares a breaker with the lift system. He whispered into his mic, "We cut one." We cut the other. Clean. Lovely, Kenny crackled. Means I can bypass their signal altogether without setting off a loop error. Danny closed the door gently behind him and wheeled his mop away like a ghost. That night, the crew reassembled in Brian's garage, which now doubled as a command center. The shelves were packed with old newspapers, broken tools, and a poster of Rita Hayworth that had aged like milk. A whiteboard had been hastily nailed up beside a calendar from 2007. Brian circled the group with a pointer, like a schoolteacher about to lose his patience. Front door? Too much exposure. Same for the loading dock. That leaves the lift shaft. Danny nodded. I checked the schematics. The shaft runs to the basement. If we rig a platform, we can lower in our tools. Kenny held up a thumb drive. Security systems garbage. I'll loop the footage, jam the comms, and fake a system update while we're in. Terry chewed thoughtfully on a cold sausage roll. What about the vault door? You're not going to drill through that, are you? We'll die of arthritis before it opens. No, said Brian, tapping a photo of a brick wall. We go in through the back. Maintenance corridor has a wall just 30 inches thick between us and the vault. That's where we drill. Billy, the youngest and most fidgety, raised his hand like a student. I might have found a place to dump the getaway van. Old warehouse. Private land. No CCTV. For once, muttered Danny, you're actually useful. Billy sneered. We're all going to be rich, right? Cut me some slack. Brian gave him a long look. That depends on how quiet, smart, and sober you stay. The next few days were a blur of awkward training montages. Not exactly Ocean's 11, more like Ocean's Geriatric 6. They practiced hauling duffel bags filled with bricks. Danny taught the others how to rappel, using rope tied to Brian's fence post. Terry pulled a hamstring and spent an hour swearing at a garden gnome. Kenny nearly electrocuted himself testing a signal jammer. Still, there was progress. Brian reviewed their communications gear, testing radio headsets that could work through layers of concrete. Terry took inventory of drills, bolt cutters, gloves, snacks, and enough WD-40 to serve as a battleship. Billy, despite the group's disdain, proved useful. He found an abandoned meat locker in East Ham to stash tools, rigged the false maintenance uniforms, and even borrowed an unregistered van. I've also got us burner phones, he said, tossing them into a box. Where'd you get 'em? Asked Brian. Friend in Essex. Not dodgy. Danny snorted. That's like saying he's a clean pig farmer. But Brian was impressed. Just a little. One evening, Brian stayed behind the garage long after the others left. He stared at the blueprint under a flickering light bulb, fingers tracing the lines like Braille. He was trying to feel it in his bones. A knock came at the door. It was Kenny, holding 2 cans of Guinness. Thought you might want a drink. They sat on tool crates, sipping silently. You worried? Kenny asked. Brian nodded. Yeah, but not for the job. What then? Brian looked away. My daughter, she's just started asking where I used to disappear to. She's proud I went straight. Doesn't know I've only been dormant. Kenny chuckled. We're dinosaurs, mate. Just doing one last roar. I want to leave something behind, Brian said quietly. Something that's not a lie. Kenny handed him another can. Then maybe don't get caught. The week before Easter, London buzzed with its usual blend of tourists, traders, and overworked detectives sipping vending machine coffee. Nobody suspected that, tucked away in a shed in Walthamstow, a bunch of pensioners were finalizing a heist that would humiliate the entire Metropolitan Police. Brian gathered the crew one last time. This is it. Friday night, we go in. We finish by Sunday. Bags in, bags out. No mess, no noise, no surprises. Danny sharpened a crowbar. What if the lift's compromised? We abort. What if someone sees us? We abort. What if my knees lock up halfway in? Ask Terry. We drag your fossilized corpse out and retire anyway. Laughter again. The kind of laughter only desperate men can manage before everything changes. Brian raised his pint. To the last job. They clinked glasses. Terry added, and may our bladder survive the wait. Chapter 4. The plan, the pint, and the pacemaker. By the time the sun dipped behind London's skyline on Thursday evening, the city was humming with the promise of a long Easter weekend. Offices closed early. Tube stations filled with tired commuters and sugared-up children. Tourists drifted to the West End, snapping selfies and dodging pigeons. And beneath it all, in a quiet garage in Walthamstow, 6 criminals, the combined age of nearly 4 centuries, prepared to commit the most audacious burglary the country had seen in decades. The workshop was chaos. Tools cluttered tables. Uniforms were ironed and stacked with military precision. Terry stood by the drill cases, reading the checklist out loud like a drill sergeant in orthopedic shoes. Hilti DD3 50 diamond core drill, 3-foot tungsten bits, backup generator, breathing masks, ear protection, waterproof tarps, energy bars. Billy, for God's sake, no more Haribo. Billy looked up from stuffing sour gummies into his mouth. Why not? They're not tactical, Terry snapped. They're childish. This is a professional operation, not a school field trip, says the man who brought a bloody thermos of Bovril. That's sustenance, not sugar. Danny raised a hand. Can we all shut up for 5 minutes? I'm trying to calibrate the bore stabilizer, and Kenny's breathing like he's making love to the air. Kenny, half dozing in the corner with a radio in his lap, cracked one eye open. It's these bloody sinuses. Get off my back. Brian stood over the blueprint taped to the wall, silent. He didn't say much that evening, but everyone could feel the tension radiating from him like steam from a kettle about to whistle. His hands were still steady, but his eyes moved too fast. He was calculating every outcome, the drill speed, the time per box, the margin for error. At last, he clapped once. All right, final brief. Everyone fell quiet, even Billy. Tomorrow night, we meet at 10 p.m. sharp. Park 2 blocks from the site. Kenny sets a jammer and runs a loop. Danny, Terry, you breach the shaft. Billy, you carry. I'll stay topside to coordinate, and then help with extraction once we breach. We hit the wall by midnight. Vault open by dawn. Load the bags. Out by morning. No one spoke. The air was thick with anticipation. Brian's voice dropped. This isn't like the old days. We don't get second chances. No repeat jobs. We screw this up, we go to prison. We pull it off, we vanish. He paused. I've spent years pretending I was done with this life, that I was just an old man with some medals, a dusty shed, and a daughter who still believes I was a soldier instead of thief. I need this, not just the money, the closure. Danny nodded slowly. We all need something. Speak for yourself, muttered Terry. I just hate the government. That night, each man went a separate way. One last evening before the descent into legend or disaster. #Brian. He returned to his small flat in Ealing. The television was on, playing a documentary about World War II spies. A photo of his daughter, mid-30s, bright smile, 2 kids, sat on the mantel. He stared at it for a long time. Then he opened the drawer below and pulled out a sealed envelope. He wrote her name on it. In case I don't come back, he thought, she deserves to know the truth, or at least part of it. He placed it behind a photo and walked away. #Danny. Danny went for a run. His knees protested, his lungs wheezed, but his mind needed the clarity. He jogged through Hyde Park, avoiding the tourists and the smell of overpriced hot dogs. He wasn't doing it for fitness. He was clearing the ghosts, the echoes of military briefings, comrades who never came home, missions that ended in smoke and screams. This was cleaner. In theory. #Kenny. Kenny stayed up all night fiddling with wires, test feeds, backup systems, and a USB stick loaded with every exploit he could think of. He wasn't the best hacker in the world. He was just old enough to remember when the best ones had to build the hardware themselves. He had dreams, though. He always did before a job. This one featured Margaret Thatcher riding a Greyhound into the vault and shouting, "You're late, #Terry." Terry visited his ex-wife. She didn't answer the door, but he left a letter in the postbox anyway. It read, "Dear Ruth, you once told me I'd die poor, bitter, and unshaved. I'm working on the last one. If I vanish, it's not because I didn't care. It's because I cared too late. I'm sorry. Yours, T. #Billy." Billy didn't go home. He hit a pub, tried to flirt with a bartender, failed, and spent the rest of the night nursing pints and fantasizing about his cut. He saw the flat in Ibiza, the vintage car, the watch, the women, the freedom. He also saw flashing blue lights, a courtroom, handcuffs. But mostly he saw money. At 9:45 p.m. on Good Friday, they arrived one by one in silence. The van was loaded. The uniforms were zipped. Brian passed out earpieces and burner phones. Nobody said a word until Kenny broke the silence. "I forgot my pacemaker manual." Everyone groaned. "Relax. Just kidding." Terry threw a screwdriver at him. It missed by a mile. Brian climbed into the driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life. "Let's go make history," he said. And with that, 6 old men, one with gout, one with a pacemaker, one with PTSD, and one with a pocket full of Haribo, drove into the heart of London to rob a vault no one thought could be breached. They parked on a side street near Hatton Garden, dressed in overalls, hard hats, and high-vis vests. If anyone saw them, they'd assume they were night maintenance, which was a point. Kenny set up the jammer in the van, linking it to a laptop running signal cloaking software disguised as a Spotify playlist. Danny and Terry began unloading the tools and wheeling them into the building's rear service entrance. Billy, red-faced and sweating, carried heavy bags up the alley. Brian checked the time. 11:07 p.m. "We're live," he said. And with that, the bad grandpas disappeared into the night, swallowed by concrete history and the promise of a payday too good to ignore. Chapter 5. Breaking Through. The basement of the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit building was cold, dusty, and utterly silent, save for the occasional groan of ancient pipes. It smelled like mold and money. Brian led the team down the narrow service corridor. The passage was tight, lined with electrical conduit and layers of forgotten dust. Their steel-toed boots clunked softly on concrete, dulled by the tarps they laid out to keep the noise down. "Billy, check the lift shaft," Brian said. Billy jogged ahead, using a flashlight wrapped in red cellophane to preserve night vision. He pried open the lift doors using a crowbar, revealing the narrow, claustrophobic shaft that led down to the vault corridor. "It's clear," he called. Brian peered down. This is where it begins. They lowered their tools and gear by rope, one piece at a time. The Hilti diamond core drill came last, protected like a newborn child. Once everything was in place, Danny and Terry slipped into harnesses and helmets. Kenny's voice crackled in their earpieces from a van outside. "You're good on cameras." "Signal's holding." Brian nodded. "Right. Time it. We start drilling now." The sound began like a purr, A soft metallic growl as Danny placed a drill against the concrete wall that led to the vault. Slowly, it increased in pitch, biting into the centuries-old masonry like a relentless mosquito. "Beautiful," Terry muttered, guiding the stabilizer arm. "It's like ballet." "If ballet gave you tinnitus," Danny grunted. Billy held a flashlight, watching every move. His fingers twitched, nervous and eager. He'd never seen a heist in motion before. Only imagined it in half-baked dreams and cheap movies. Brian stood behind them, stopwatch in hand, expression unreadable. After 20 minutes, the drill was pulled back. Dust puffed out in gray clouds. "Depth check," Danny ordered. Terry tapped the bore with a metal rod. 10 inches. Another foot and we hit the secondary wall. Then we're in business. Another session began. The drill shrieked like a banshee this time, louder, angrier. The whir of the motor vibrated in Billy's spine. Kenny crackled in. "Watch the noise levels. You're close to tripping the seismic sensor." Brian adjusted the torque. "We go slower. Let's not set off every bloody alarm in central London." Sweat beaded on foreheads. Muscles ached. Dust coated everything. But by 2:45 a.m., they had carved a perfect circular tunnel into the wall. Terry whistled. If Michelangelo drilled holes, this be one of his. They swapped out for the breaker, a brute force hydraulic ram designed to punch through the secondary vault wall. Danny held it like a battering ram, guiding its weight with both hands. Boom! The first impact echoed like a thunderclap. Brian froze. Too loud. Kenny's voice came in fast. "You spiked the meter. Easy. One more hit, no more." Danny nodded and lined up the second shot. Boom! The wall cracked. Danny leaned against it, panting. "We're through." Terry stepped forward and shoved. The broken segment of wall shifted, then toppled inward with a thud. A rush of cool, still air greeted them. On the other side lay the vault. Rows of safety deposit boxes, small metal doors that hid the dreams and sins of London's elite. Billy's eyes went wide. "Holy, it's real." Brian exhaled slowly. "Welcome to the heart." They stepped inside like explorers entering a pharaoh's tomb. The air was dense with stale perfume and metal. Dust motes floated in the beam of Billy's flashlight. The vault was compact, maybe 20 feet across, but every inch glittered with potential. Terry rubbed his hands. "All right, let's dance." He and Danny approached the first row of safety boxes and began the age-old ritual. Crowbars, bolt cutters, and mini drills. Box after box gave way under their seasoned hands. Inside, diamond necklaces, Rolex watches, stacks of cash, old passports, rubies the size of eyeballs, and occasionally something stranger. Terry held up a gold crucifix and frowned. Why do rich people keep religious icons next to porn? Danny grunted, pulling out a velvet pouch full of emeralds. Because both are things you beg for in hard times. Billy scurried between them with duffel bags, loading them up. "We're gonna need more bags." Brian was quiet. His eyes scanned each item like a museum curator in a war zone. It wasn't greed. It was reverence. "These boxes are stories," he murmured. Weddings, bribes, insurance scams, inheritances were stealing entire lifetimes. Terry yanked open a stubborn box. "Well, these lifetimes are buying me a boat." By 5:15 a.m., they'd emptied nearly 70 boxes. Brian checked his watch. "We're behind." Danny wiped sweat from his face. "We hit a couple tougher ones. Took longer. We can't afford longer. Light comes up in 2 hours. Wrap it." Just then, Billy appeared, looking sheepish. Guys..." Terry paused mid-box. Billy continued, I left the second generator in the van. We're gonna overload the drill motor soon. if we keep going without it. Danny looked ready to explode. You had one job. Billy stammered. I thought we'd have enough juice. Brian didn't yell. He simply said, go get it, now, and don't be seen. Billy nodded and darted back through the lift shaft, climbing like a rat. The rest of the team pushed harder. More boxes were breached. Jewels spilled like secrets on the tarps. Brian suddenly crouched by a box and pulled something out, a photo, old and worn. It showed a young woman, maybe 20, holding a child. He turned it over. To my darling boy, never forget where you come from. He stared at it for a beat too long. Terry noticed. Something wrong. Brian pocketed the photo. Just ghosts. Outside, the sun began its slow creep. In the van, Kenny watched the screen. Guys, you got 90 minutes before this street starts waking up. Danny shouted from below, then tell Billy to get his arse back here. He did. 5 minutes later, breathless, generator in hand, and reeking of beer. Don't ask, he gasped. Some drunk guy tried to pee on the van. I had to chase him off. Terry clutched his chest. You led someone to the van? No, I got rid of him. He was barely conscious. Brian closed his eyes. Let's not fall apart now. Get the drill back online. At 9:45 p.m. on Good Friday, they arrived one by one in silence. The van was loaded. The uniforms were zipped. Brian passed out earpieces and burner phones. Nobody said a word until Kenny broke the silence. I forgot my pacemaker manual. Everyone groaned. Relax. Just kidding. Terry threw a screwdriver at him. It missed by a mile. Brian climbed into the driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life. Let's go make history, he said. And with that, 6 old men, one with gout, one with a pacemaker, one with PTSD, and one with a pocket full of Haribo, drove into the heart of London to rob a vault no one thought could be breached. They parked on a side street near Hatton Garden, dressed in overalls, hard hats, and high-vis vests. If anyone saw them, they'd assume they were night maintenance, which was a point. Kenny set up the jammer in the van, linking it to a laptop running signal cloaking software disguised as a Spotify playlist. Danny and Terry began unloading the tools and wheeling them into the building's rear service entrance. Billy, red-faced and sweating, carried heavy bags up the alley. Brian checked the time. 11:07 p.m. We're live, he said. And with that, the bad grandpas disappeared into the night, swallowed by concrete history and the promise of a payday too good to ignore. Chapter 6. Trouble Brews. The van rattled through London's morning hush, gliding past sleepy-eyed cyclists and yawning shopkeepers unlocking their shutters. In the back, 10 duffel bags lay under a false floor, nestled beside a crate of garden supplies and old boxes marked Model Railway Club. Billy sat in the passenger seat jittery, chewing the skin around his thumb. Turn left here, he said. Brian gripped the wheel without looking. I know the way. Just making sure. Making sure got us almost spotted last night. Let's keep the commentary to a minimum, yeah? Billy shrank into his seat. In the back, Danny and Terry exchanged a glance. Even under the veil of victory, something in the air was off. Tense, like the moments before a storm. Kenny's voice came from the earpiece. All clear. You're ghosts. Brian sighed. Then let's disappear. Their temporary hideout was a warehouse in Edmonton, half of it crammed with pigeon cages, the other half masquerading as a defunct print shop. The whole place smelled like ink and bird droppings. Danny backed the van into the loading bay. The moment the door clicked shut, the energy shifted. The laughter started. Terry cracked first, falling against a stack of pallets. We bloody did it. Danny joined in. No alarms, no heat, no one dead. Just us, the loot, and a clean exit. Billy threw open the van doors and jumped in the back, unzipping one of the bags. Jesus, look at this. He pulled out a velvet-lined pouch and appended it. Diamonds spilled into his hand like sugar. Kenny stepped inside, squinting in the low light. How much you reckon? Brian was scanning the bags methodically. Too early to say. Could be 14, 15 million. Maybe more. Terry grinned. Enough to get a new hip and a house in Marbella. Brian nodded. And enough rope to hang ourselves if we're not careful. They divided the bags into 5 sections and stashed them in different lockups across East London. No one carried more than a share. No one knew where all of it was. A fail-safe, just in case someone got greedy or stupid. Billy, you'll handle the fence, Brian said. Billy blinked. Me? Why me? You're the youngest. Less chance of recognition. And you're the one who wanted more responsibility. Billy hesitated, then nodded. Right, I'll sort it. Kenny looked up from polishing his glasses. And don't sell it all at once. You flog a ruby the size of a walnut, and someone's going to notice. Yeah, I know. Do you? Brian put a hand on Billy's shoulder. You've got a shot here. Don't cock it up. Billy smiled, but his foot bounced nervously beneath him. 3 days later, the Daily Mail hit the stands. Geriatric gang in daring vault robbery. Thieves escaped with £14 million over Easter weekend. Police say heist highly professional. The room fell into stunned silence. Danny read aloud. Entry via lift shaft, wall drill with industrial tools. Hundreds of safety boxes opened. No suspects, no forensic leads. Terry beamed. They haven't got a bloody clue. Brian's face was stone. They will. What? You think they'll figure us out? Maybe not today. But sooner or later, someone talks. Someone slips. Kenny looked up. You're not wrong. Billy tried to laugh. We were clean, right? We wore gloves. No prints. We were ghosts. Brian didn't smile. Ghosts still cast shadows. The next few weeks were chaos under calm. They laid low. No big purchases. No flash. But as the press fanned the flames, so did public curiosity and police attention. Interpol got involved. MI5 flirted with the case, mostly for the headlines. And journalists camped outside Hatton Garden like it was Area 51. The gang had become folklore. The bad grandpas. The media called them. A name that made Danny want to punch something. What do they think we are? A bingo team with bolt cutters, he growled. They think we're too old to be dangerous, Kenny replied. That's the bloody problem. Then came the first real crack. Billy, he couldn't help himself. He started spending, not stupidly, not obviously, but enough. A new leather jacket, nights out in Soho, a whisper here, a rumor there. He met a girl, a waitress named Alina, pretty, clever, and unfortunately, curious. You said you worked construction, she said, eyeing his gold ring. That doesn't look like a builder's wage. It was a good month, Billy muttered. You're hiding something. Billy laughed it off, but the seed was planted. A few nights later, Alina answered a call from an unknown number on Billy's phone while he was in the shower. It was a fence, talking about diamonds. Her face went pale. When Billy emerged, dripping and smiling, she was holding the phone. What did you do, Billy? Back at the warehouse. Brian was cleaning his tools when Danny burst in. Billy slipping. Brian paused. Define slipping. He's got a girl. She's smart. He's spending. And last week, I saw him near a shop in Clerkenwell that handles unregistered gems. Police watch it. Brian's jaw tightened. We bring him in. Billy arrived at the warehouse the next day, bouncing in with coffee and a grin. Hey lads, you'll never guess who recognized me today. Some guy from school. He froze. All five were waiting, silent. Brian stood at the center, arms crossed. "Sit down, Billy." The coffee cups dropped from his hands. "What's going on?" "You tell us." Danny snapped. "You've been sloppy." "I haven't." "You've been seen," Brian interrupted. "You've been talking to a fence we didn't clear. You've been spending." Billy's face flushed. "I've been careful." "No, you've been lucky," Kenny said. Brian took a deep breath. "You're compromising the job. You talk, we all go down." Billy looked around the room, at these aging men with their lined faces and tired eyes. He wanted to be one of them. He did. But fear was now overriding loyalty. "What happens now?" Brian walked over, put a hand on his shoulder. "You stay quiet. You lay low. No more selling. And you break it off with the girl." Billy stiffened. "Why?" "Because people in love get careless. And this isn't a rom-com, Billy. This is the kind of story where people end up in courtrooms or graves." But it was already too late. That night, Alina disappeared. And so did a copy of Billy's phone. Chapter 7, The Net Titans. Alina sat on the bench in a small park behind the Soho church, her coat wrapped tightly around her despite the early spring sun. The bag beside her held little more than essentials: a few clothes, makeup, a burner phone, and buried beneath a scarf, a folded sheet of paper with scribbled names and numbers. She wasn't a snitch. Not really. But something about Billy's world scared her. He wasn't just fibbing about working construction. This was something darker, older. That phone call she overheard hadn't mentioned a single word about tools, shifts, or blueprints. It talked about rocks. Real ones. And wait, in carats. When she Googled the name Hatton Garden, her stomach dropped. She glanced at the church doors. They stayed shut. She wasn't religious, not really, but the quiet made it easier to think. Then the door beside the rectory opened. Detective Inspector Nick Garrett stepped out, crisp in his wool coat and scuffed leather shoes, wearing the face of a man who hadn't slept in 2 weeks. His partner, D.I. Sophie Price, followed. Alina stood. "I don't want anyone to get hurt." "Good," Garrett said. "Let's make sure of that." Back in the warehouse, Brian was staring at an article in The Guardian. Police zero in on Hatton Garden suspects. Sources say, age no barrier crime. A photo showed a blurry figure outside a pub not far from the vault. The figure was grainy, but to Brian, it was unmistakably Billy. That slouched posture, that bomber jacket. He folded the paper and lit a cigarette with shaky hand. Terry looked up from his crossword. "They getting close?" Brian didn't answer right away. Then, "We're ghosts, remember?" Terry scoffed. "You don't believe that." "No," Brian said, "I don't." Billy sat alone in his flat above a shuttered kebab shop, chain smoking and staring at his phone. No calls, no texts. Alina had vanished. He knew what that meant. He'd lied to her. He'd told her the diamonds were from a job years ago, some petty little smash and grab, but he'd seen her face. She'd put the pieces together. And now she was gone. He heard the buzz of his intercom and flinched. His hand hovered over the drawer where he kept a snub-nosed revolver, the kind no one was supposed to know he had. He pressed the button. "Who is it?" Silence. Then a voice, familiar, rough. "Open up, Billy. It's Danny." At New Scotland Yard, D.I. Garrett pinned a map on the board. It was covered in red strings and faces. Half of them were old, wrinkled, white hair, gray stubble, retired plumbers, former electricians, ex-cons with arthritis, and grandchildren. "Don't let the age fool you," Garrett said. "These guys are career criminals. They know the system. They've lived in it longer than we've been out of school." D.I. Price pointed to a CCTV freeze frame of Kenny near the Hatton Garden building. We looped in traffic cam footage from the night of the heist. Our guy in GCHQ enhanced the angle from across the street. It's not much, but the timing fits. Collins left the scene at 6:47 a.m. Garrett nodded. That's enough for a warrant. Meanwhile, Danny sat across from Billy at his kitchen table, both hands folded calmly. The younger man looked like a storm, sweaty, anxious, wound tight. I didn't talk to her, Billy said. Not properly. She figured it out. Danny raised an eyebrow. And what did you do then? Nothing. Asterisk, nothing asterisk? I didn't tell her anything. I just panicked. Danny leaned in. You panicked, and now she's gone. And you don't see a problem? Billy looked at the window, his reflection pale and drawn. What if she went to the police? Danny was quiet. Then we got about 48 hours before someone kicks in the door. By the following morning, that prophecy came true. Kenny was in his dressing gown, halfway through his cornflakes, when the front door was reduced to splinters. Police, stay where you are. He blinked owlishly. You boys ever try knocking? 10 minutes later, he was in cuffs. They bagged his hearing aid, his laptop, and his model train collection. Danny met Brian in a canal side cafe under gray skies. Kenny's in. Brian didn't flinch. He'll hold. They all think they will. You don't trust him? I trust that he's tired, cold, and has arthritis in 3 joints. All they have to do is put him in a cell, without his pills, and he'll sing. Brian stirred his tea. Then we hope they're polite. Terry, ever the clown, arrived at Brian's later that day wearing a floppy hat and sunglasses, carrying a plastic bag full of loose gems. Do I look like a man in trouble? You look like a man who wants to be caught. He handed Brian the bag. We need to start selling again. Carefully. Kenny's got people. He told me about one in Belgium. We sit tight. For how long? Until I say otherwise. Terry looked away. You're not the boss anymore, Brian. Brian met his eyes. Aren't I? Silence. Then Terry pulled out a bottle of whiskey, twisted the cap, and took a swig. Meanwhile, Billy packed. Not for a trip, not for a life on the run. Just enough to vanish for a while. He grabbed cash, the last of his share, and a burner phone. But as he stepped into the hallway, someone was waiting. Garrett. 2 officers flanked him. Billy Lincoln. We need to talk. In an interview room at Scotland Yard, Billy sat hunched in a chair. His knuckles were white. He looked at Garrett and Price with the eyes of a man unraveling. We know who you are, Price said. We know what you did. You've got nothing, he whispered. We've got CCTV. A girl who made a call. Surveillance footage of you visiting a fence in Clerkenwell. We've got enough to make your life hell. Silence. Then Garrett said the line that did it. We've already arrested Kenny. Billy blinked. Garrett leaned forward. You know what happens next. You're the youngest. That makes you the best bargaining chip. Billy swallowed. You give me a deal? We're offering immunity for a full confession and the location of the remaining assets. Billy stared at the table and thought about Alina. Back at the warehouse, Brian watched the local news on an old television with rabbit ears. Asterisk, sources close to the investigation say several suspects are now in custody and more arrests are imminent. Asterisk, he poured himself a cup of tea. Terry sat beside him, unusually quiet. You think Billy talked? He asked. Brian nodded once. Probably. Terry sighed. It was a good run. Brian raised his cup in salute. It was... They clinked mugs like old soldiers sharing their final drink. Outside, sirens wailed. Chapter 8. The Fall. Rain painted London in shades of slate and silver as D.I. Garrett stood outside the rusted iron gate of a modest attached house in Croydon. His overcoat was soaked, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was a list he'd been carrying in his breast pocket for months. 6 names, 1 vault, 14 million pounds, and the audacity to make fools out of the entire Metropolitan Police. He nodded to the officers behind him. "Let's finish this." Brian Reeder heard the knock on his door before the police even called out. He didn't panic. He didn't move. Instead, he turned off the kettle and walked calmly to the door. He opened it just as the first officer raised a boot to kick it in. "No need for theatrics," Brian said with a weary smile. "I was expecting you." As they cuffed him, he looked back at the house. Photos of his late wife lined the mantel. A dusty orchid bloomed under the kitchen window. "Leave the flowers alone, eh?" he said to no one in particular. Terry Perkins was arrested at his weekly bingo night. They found him surrounded by pensioners, halfway through a joke about a nun and a chainsaw when the handcuffs clicked shut. "Honestly," he said as they read him his rights, "I only came for the raffle." A few of the older women clapped as he was let out. One even blew him a kiss. "You'll always be our Terry," she shouted. He winked. "Still got it." Danny Jones didn't go quietly. When the police came for him at his flat in Kentish Town, he bolted out the back, hopped 2 fences, and made it nearly 4 blocks before a patrol car screeched in front of him. As they wrestled him to the pavement, he spat out a tooth and laughed. "You lot move quicker than I thought." One of the younger officers muttered, "For a granddad, he's bloody fast." Kenny Collins was already in custody, but now the pressure was on. Garrett sat across from him in the interview room, files spread out like playing cards. "You think your mates are still keeping quiet?" Garrett asked. Kenny stared at the table. Billy already flipped. He gave us the location of 3 stash points. We recovered nearly $2 million in cash and jewels. Kenny grunted. He always was a little snake. "You can be angry later," Garrett said. "Right now, we need the rest. You help us find the rest, and I can make sure you serve your time somewhere with heat, meds, and hot meals. Otherwise, it's a freezing cell in Wormwood Scrubs." Kenny leaned back. "You know what your problem is?" Garrett arched a brow. "You think we're scared of jail. But half of us spent more time behind bars than we did outside." Garrett smiled. "Fair enough. But what about dying there?" Silence. Then Kenny sighed. "Give me a pen." The press had a field day. Bad grandpas bagged. Diamond geezers behind bars. Pensioner plunder. Pound 14M looted by retired criminals. For days, the headlines were relentless. Tabloids printed charts showing who did what, how they got in, what was stolen. Photos of the vault, the hole in the wall, the tools. It was like something out of a Hollywood film. Some called them villains. Others called them heroes. But none could deny they were legends. In their cells, the crew found themselves adjusting to prison life once more. Brian got a single bunk with a view of the prison garden. He spent hours watching birds land on the wire fence, his mind wandering between memories of the heist and memories of his wife. Terry became the toast of the cell block. He told stories during lunch, taught the young inmates poker, and even started a workout club he called the Geriatric Giants. "Biceps before bedpans," he'd yell as they lifted rusty dumbbells. Danny kept mostly to himself. He read war novels, worked out quietly, and watched everyone with the calm patience of a soldier who'd already survived worse. Kenny got a job in the prison library, where he smuggled biscuits under the counter for anyone willing to trade gossip. And Billy? Billy was in witness protection. His deal got him time served and a new identity, but it cost him everything else. He left London for somewhere anonymous, quiet. Nobody knew where, not even Alina. She was gone too. The trial was a circus. Reporters packed the courtroom. Sketch artists couldn't keep up with all the expressions. Terry's smirks, Danny's death stares, Kenny's exaggerated yawns. Brian spoke only once. The judge asked, "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Reader?" He rose slowly. "I do." The courtroom held its breath. "We didn't steal out of greed," Brian said. "We stole because we were good at it, because this world forgets people like us. You work, you age, and then you vanish. We didn't want to vanish." The judge said nothing. Neither did the jury. Sentences came down heavy, but not crushing. Brian, 6 years. Terry, 7 years. Danny, 6 years. Kenny, 5 years. The judge considered their ages, their health, and, though she'd never admit it, their style. Inside prison, life continued. They were celebrities now. Inmates called them the Firm, the Fossils, or simply the Legends. They had fan mail. People sent cigars, crossword puzzles, even framed photos of the vault hole. Terry once received a marriage proposal from a 68-year-old woman in Essex. He wrote back, "Only if you don't snore." One night, 2 years into their sentences, the four of them sat at a table in the rec room playing bridge. Danny looked up suddenly. "You ever think about what we could have done with the other 6 million? Kenny shrugged. "Probably bought more biscuits." Brian just smiled. Not all of it was lost. Terry perked up. "What's that mean?" Brian looked down at his cards. "Just saying, maybe some things went uncounted." Danny narrowed his eyes. "Brian, what did you do?" But Brian never answered. And from that day on, every time a new officer walked a wing or a plumber fixed a pipe near the east wall, the others looked for signs, a clue, a signal, and wondered. Chapter 9, Exit Strategies. Spring came late to London that year, as if the city itself had taken to moving slower. Like the old men had locked up, the cherry blossoms bloomed over the prison yard wall, fluttering down like confetti from some forgotten party. Inside HMP Wandsworth, Brian Reader was packing his things into a box no bigger than a microwave. A toothbrush, a pair of slippers, a creased photograph of his wife, and a leather-bound notebook with no writing on the front. His time was up. As the officer escorted him out, Brian turned to glance one last time at the prison wing, where Danny and Kenny stood near the window, watching in silence. "Don't go soft on me, lads," he called. "You still me 10 quid from poker night," Danny replied. Brian gave a parting wave, then disappeared through the gate. He was 79 years old. Terry Perkins didn't get to walk free. He died 2 months before his scheduled release, slipping away quietly in the prison infirmary after a heart attack during a heated argument over crossword clues. The headline in the Daily Mail read, "Diamond Heist Ringleader Dies Behind Bars. Legend to the End." At his funeral, only 3 mourners stood under gray Kent sky. Brian, Danny, and Lucy, the nurse from Bingo Night, who claimed he once promised her a ruby. Brian tossed a coin into the grave. "For luck," he murmured. Danny added, "For the getaway car that never came." Kenny Collins was next to be released. He didn't walk out with a smirk or swagger. He just squinted at the sunlight and mumbled, "Still smells like petrol and betrayal." He developed a limp in prison, courtesy of slipping on a soap bar during a failed breakdance attempt after 1 too many contraband whiskeys. Brian picked him up in an old Morris Minor. "Couldn't spring for something flash?" Kenny asked, throwing his bag into the back seat. Brian shrugged. "We're supposed to be broke, remember?" Kenny smirked. "For now." Danny Jones came out last. He'd aged the worst. His joints were stiff and his eyesight dimmed, but his instincts remained razor-sharp. When he stepped out, he paused by the gate and sniffed the air. "Still here," he muttered. Outside, Brian and Kenny waited. Danny got in the back without a word. No one asked what came next. They took up residence in a modest bungalow in Essex, owned on paper by a fake company that Brian had created decades earlier during a cigarette smuggling scheme in Gibraltar. The neighbors thought they were ex-soldiers or retired bookies, which honestly wasn't far off. Their days settled into a strange rhythm. Mornings were for tea, toast, and shouting at the telly. Afternoons for walks by the river or playing cards. Evenings were filled with silence, and sometimes questions that never made it past the lips. One evening, Kenny said aloud, "Brian, you hinted there was more. Back in prison." Brian didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out the leather-bound notebook, and placed it on the table. Kenny opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn map. A single red X marked a spot in Hampstead. Coordinates. A name, asterisk, Peabody's shed. Asterisk, Danny leaned over. What the hell is this? Brian lit a cigarette. Something he hadn't done in over a decade. Something I stashed. For retirement. They arrived at Peabody's the next day. It was a long-abandoned locksmith shop, now half swallowed by ivy and bureaucracy. Brian used a key he kept hidden in the heel of an old boot. Inside, dust blanketed everything like a forgotten memory. In the back, under loose floorboards, they found it, a red toolbox. Heavy, Brian opened it. Stacks of wrapped diamonds glinted in the weak sunlight. "I kept a few," he said, smiling. Didn't trust the plan completely, especially not with Billy involved. Kenny sat down, stunned. "You absolute bastard." Danny was already laughing. They didn't say anything for a long time. Just sat there, staring at the box. Finally, Brian asked, "So one more job?" But this wasn't a heist. Not this time. This was a cleanup. They moved carefully, selling pieces off to old contacts in Antwerp and Switzerland. Not flashy. Quiet. Professional. They used burner phones, fake names, and old passports. They knew the rules now, and the price of getting caught again. They used the money not to buy yachts or mansions, but to build a life, a real one. Brian bought a cottage in Devon and a greenhouse to grow orchids. Kenny invested in a model railway shop and gave free workshops to kids. Danny bought a small cabin in Scotland off the grid and started writing a book, a memoir, fictionalized, of course. Years passed. London changed. Skyscrapers replaced skylines. Electric cars hummed where black cabs once ruled. But sometimes, late at night, a headline would resurface, or an old copper would whisper a name at the pub. The Hatton Garden lot. Legends never die. One day, a young journalist named Priya Sharma tracked down Danny in the Highlands. She was writing a piece called Asterisk, The Last Job. Asterisk, "Why'd you do it?" she asked, recording. Danny looked out at the hills. "Because we could." She blinked. "That's it." He shook his head. "That's everything." Chapter 10, the final play. The Devon coast shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Seagulls cried overhead. Waves lapped the shore, and Brian Reeder, now 83, watched as orchids bloomed from a creaky deck chair with a cup of tea in hand. It had been nearly a decade since Hatton Garden, and life had grown quiet. Too quiet. He didn't mind the stillness. Not anymore. After all, he had lived a life measured in lockpicks and diamonds, in whispers and close shaves. Silence was a luxury he had once stolen from the world. Now it came freely. The doorbell rang. He stood slowly, knees cracking like broken vinyl. No one visited without calling. When he opened the door, he blinked in disbelief. Alina, the woman before him, was older now, early 50s perhaps, but unmistakably the same fire-eyed woman who once sat in Billy's lap during planning meetings, half listening and fully judging. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past him and dropped her bag on the kitchen table. "You're not even going to pretend you're surprised?" "I'm old, not stupid," Brian said, shutting the door. "You want tea?" "Whiskey." "Now you're talking." 10 minutes later, they sat on the back deck, each nursing a generous glass. She spoke first. "Billy's dead." Brian lowered his glass. "When?" 2 months ago. Car crash. Florida. He was calling himself Rick DeMarco and selling fake NFTs to tech brothers. Brian smirked. "Sound like him." "He left this," she said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a sealed envelope. Yellowed, weathered, and marked only with one word. "Brian." He opened it. Inside was a single sentence, scrawled in Billy's boyish hand. Asterisk, check the phone box on Baker Street. You'll know which one. Asterisk, Brian exhaled. The idiot actually did it. Did what? Set the last trap. The next day, Brian took a train to London. He wore a tweed coat, a battered hat, and the tired look of a man walking into his past. Baker Street was buzzing. Tourists snapping selfies with Sherlock statues, and commuters hustling with AirPods and lattes. He found the phone box halfway down the street. Red, faded, covered in stickers. He opened the door. Taped inside behind the phone was a black duffel bag. No cameras nearby. Classic Billy. Brian took it, heart hammering. Inside, a burner phone, an address in Istanbul, and a USB drive. Back in Devon, he gathered Danny and Kenny. "I think Billy left us one last game," he said. Kenny groaned. "Can't we just play bingo like normal pensioners?" But Danny was already loading up the USB. It contained video footage, grainy but clear, of Billy sitting in front of a pile of uncut diamonds. "If you're seeing this," Billy said on video, "I'm dead, and probably not peacefully. I knew someone was tailing me after the sale in Portugal. Might have been in my 5. Might have been Sandra's cousin. Hard to say. I left the second stash. Not from Hatton Garden. This one's newer. From a job in Cyprus. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't trust anyone. Except maybe you three. The address on the drive? That's where the key is. Get it, or don't. Just don't let the bastards win." Then he winked, coughed, and the feed cut out. Danny leaned back. "One more ride." Brian smiled. "One more." 3 weeks later, 3 old men, one with a cane, one with a titanium hip, and one with a bag full of pain meds, walked off a plane in Istanbul. They looked like retired school teachers. Or maybe a poorly organized jazz trio. No one suspected a thing. They checked into a quiet hotel near Galata Tower. Kenny hacked into a customs database with a rig Kindle. Danny mapped out nearby warehouses and storage lockers. Brian made contact with a woman known only as the Bird, who owed him a favor from a job in Beirut, 1982. Within days, they had their target. A shipping container labeled medical equipment. Docked for 3 years. Unclaimed. Untouched. They found it, cracked it open, and stared into the dark. Inside were 3 trunks. One full of gold sovereigns. One full of bearer bonds. And the last? Diamonds. Rough cut. Millions. Kenny blinked. "We're too old to be this rich." Danny grinned. "That's why it's perfect." Brian closed the trunks. Time to disappear. And that's what they did. They split the haul evenly, vanished across the world, and made peace with their past. Brian returned to Devon and lived out his days surrounded by flowers, friends, and long walks by the sea. Danny moved to Argentina, bought a vineyard, and pretended not to be British. Kenny opened a jazz club in Copenhagen, called it The Vault. Every Friday, he played piano while a silent bouncer named Olaf kept the peace. Their names faded from the headlines. New scandals came. New criminals rose. But every so often, someone would whisper, they got away with it in the end. Years later, a young thief named Callum found an old copy of the Times in a second-hand bookshop. It had a yellowed front page story. Hatton Garden Heist. The final chapter? He flipped through it, eyes wide. He'd never heard of them before. He turned to the shopkeeper, an elderly man polishing a pipe. You ever heard of the bad grandpas? The shopkeeper paused, smiled faintly, and said, "Son, they weren't just grandpas. They were the last of a dying breed."
Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe if you enjoyed this crime story. If you've got a theory, memory, or favorite part of this heist, drop it in the comments. We read every single one. If you're into real crime and strange heists, and the kinds of stories they never tell you about in school, make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell, because we got a vault full of jaw-dropping stories coming your way. Check out more stories like this.